Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Better Together. It's a new series, in fact, called Better Together. And today I'm joined by two very exciting people. Say hello to Dawn and Louise. Hello, how are you guys doing?
Hello.
Hello.
Good, thank you.
Fabulous. We had a little bit of a mission getting some of the technology working today, but hopefully we can have a kind of smooth conversation from here. But let's see how it goes. Wish us luck. So, Dawn, I'm going to come to you first. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, not too bad. Happy that the sun's now shining after gale force winds last night.
Very good. How about you, Louise?
Yeah, I'm really well, thank you. And yeah, the sun is shining, always puts a little bit of a spring in your step. So yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming on to have a conversation. We're going to talk about a little bit of COVID safety and testing today. But first, Dawn, I'm going to come to you. How did you get your start in the live events industry?
So very early on, to be honest, you have to do work experience when you're about 16 at school. And I was really lucky because my dad knew someone who knew Ali Tilly, and he sort of said to them, is there anything that Dawn could help with? And Ali said, yeah, sure, come on over to Poland. So I went and worked on a live event in Poland, and I was just like, wow, I can't believe people actually do this as a job. I just really enjoyed it.
Oh, fantastic. How about you, Louise? How did you get your start?
So I had quite an interesting start. I went to university, did business studies, and had to do a year's placement. And I started working for a DMC. And that's kind of how it started. I didn't know anything about events or the DMC world. And I just sort of found myself in this work placement for a year working for a DMC. And then I was very fortunate and got a job on Sydney Olympics. So that's where it was my sort of big springboard, really, back in 2000.
Brilliant. And if you think back across your career, Dawn, what would you say was your favourite job and why?
There's so many. It's really difficult to pick. I mean, one of the best ones for me, it's one that I've done for years, and that was Cisco Live. I really enjoyed that because my sort of role on that was crew management, and through doing that, I've just met hundreds and hundreds of brilliant people. So yeah, I think that's probably one of my favourites.
How about you, Louise? Do you have a favourite job that springs to mind as you kind of look back across your working life?
There's so many, and we're so lucky to travel the world and see such exciting places. I did a fabulous job in Africa for about 6 weeks, probably about 10 years ago, and that was absolutely amazing. Just an amazing experience, amazing people, and just something I always look back really sort of fondly, and I really cherish that time. It was a very special time.
Brilliant. Amazing. So let's jump right into it. In what ways has your life been different over the past year, Dawn? How did you, how have things changed for you? Obviously, it's been significant change for so many people, but kind of what's your story been? I mean, tell me a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have ever imagined doing anything that was remotely to do with any kind of medical stuff. My mum's a nurse, and I've always been absolutely disgusted at anything remotely medical. So I've had to sort of bring myself round to a new way of thinking. But so we started working with another company, and then from there we went on and decided to start doing our own thing. And so it's been a bit of a roller coaster. I never thought I would be involved in, we're doing everything: sales, finance. Our houses are like warehouses at the moment.
Amazing. And so what happened? How did it come about? Where did it start, Dawn?
So we were working. So Lou called me out of the blue and just said, can you come and do a couple of hours helping out with some reporting stuff? And I was like, oh, yeah, excellent. That's exactly my bag. So when and she was in place at another testing company, and it was nuts. It went from two hours a day to sort of crazy 7-day weeks, really. And so we learned a huge amount from doing that. And then when our contracts came to an end, we just kind of thought, well, actually, this is something that we can bring to people we know and in the industry, because we've got all that experience now from having worked there.
And how about you, Louise? Like, how did it come about? Did you just get a phone call out of the blue as well, or like?
Well, it was really odd. I'd finished a site inspection back in March, and COVID hit, and I hadn't worked for about 14, 15 weeks, which had never happened to me in my whole life. It was the strangest experience. And then I got a call completely out of the blue from an ex-colleague that was working at a studio, and said, we'd like you to come in and run COVID testing. And I was like, wow, okay. So off I went. I had my COVID test, and I was kind of like, what does this really mean? I don't even know what the role is. I don't know how it works. And they were like, look, come back on Monday and we'll tell you all about it. So I came back on Monday quite nervous, obviously hadn't worked for 15 weeks, not knowing about COVID, not being medical. And off I was running a COVID testing site for a major movie, which was fairly scary on day one, as you can imagine. There were no processes. It was hellish hours, very like being on site on events. And we were literally learning on the job. So it was an amazing experience. I'm very, very lucky to have had that and been able to work. But yeah, I mean, my whole life is completely. So yeah, that's kind of how it came about. Literally a phone call, and I was up and running. Before I knew it, I felt like I'd never worked in the other world.
Oh, that's brilliant. So that's incredible. So you were able to take kind of a lot of the skills that you'd kind of developed over many years in the events industry, and they're actually massively transferable into. And what was it about those skills, I suppose? What was it that kind of translated over so straightforwardly?
I think it uses this word transferable skills, and everyone's like, and at the time when you've not worked for weeks, and you start to lose your confidence, you start to reflect upon yourself, you think, what are my transferable skills? But as event managers, logistics people, we have loads of skills. We're organised, we're super efficient, we're outgoing, we can work with suppliers, we can communicate with clients, we are so flexible. And the skills that we have, people that work in the corporate world have to develop those skills, and are often at very, very senior levels. But as an event manager, you have all those skills. So I hate to use this word transferable, because everybody says it. And when you're in that pit of, I haven't worked for weeks, you really, really almost hate that statement. Honestly, logistics people are great. We're dependable. We're adaptable. We're organised, and we're flexible, and we're used to working in different environments. And, turning up perhaps somewhere, we don't know who we've got to work with. We don't know. We don't know the culture. We just hit the ground running. And those skills are totally invaluable, totally.
So what was the problem, essentially, that you're trying to solve? It sounds like it was that kind of operational mindset that kind of stood you in good stead. But like, what was the actual challenge that you were faced with when you kind of started getting involved in how the film industry were dealing with it?
Yeah, firstly, no one had really done testing on that larger scale. So that's your first thing. Your second thing is timings. People need to be tested before they go onto set, before they perhaps have a meeting. Then it's about stock. Have you got enough tests in? Then it's about, can we get enough tests processed through the labs in time? So there's so many different sort of entities that you have to think about at once. And then, of course, there's that client experience, as we would call it, the delegate journey. So although there's all that stuff going on in the background, that person or cast member has still got to feel super special and looked after, and ultimately sort of medically and clinically safe, whilst running an operational environment that is very, very busy and very, very long hours. And also, this testing was to everybody in the film industry, which has basically allowed them to carry on and work now, because they are showing due diligence, and that mitigation of risk is reducing. So obviously about safety, and that's paramount, but there's an awful lot of logistics that go into it. The technology, the apps, the results. They're huge. It's a huge topic.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely amazing. And so, Dawn, like, how many tests were you sort of faced with? Like, what was the nature of the work? Without, just be sensitive to client names and that sort of thing. But what was the nature of what you're trying to do? Was it crew? What was it you're actually having to do on a daily basis?
So it was a mixture, really. There was crew, there was cast. Some days there was, over 1,000 people being tested in a day.
Wow.
It just very much depended on the day, and it was very hard to kind of have an idea of the flow of that because it was always changing. It didn't sort of stick the same every single week. So we were kind of looking at it and we were trying to work out, you have to have a backup plan for the backup plan, really, in that circumstance. So, yeah. And that's going back to what Lou was saying there, that's kind of, as logistics people, that's what we do for being on site. And so that was another thing that we were just like, right, okay, you plan and then you plan again and then you plan further.
Brilliant. So in terms of that that kind of attendee or delegate flow, obviously in this case it was kind of cast and crew, but just talk me through that work, how that worked, or what was required or what was needed. Like, so in order for crew members to get on site, they had to, did they have to prove they had a test, or just talk me through the actual flow of how it kind of worked? And in terms of the testing as well, was that like lateral flow testing? Was that PCR testing? So Dawn, firstly to you.
Yeah, so at that time, really, the main tests that were being used were the PCR test. And, to this day, they still remain to be the gold standard in the testing industry. However, there is obviously a place for lateral flow as well. So essentially how it worked for that particular site was people would come in, they would go to a drive-through centre. They would then go away, wait on their test result. And once they've had that test result, they could then come back. People were then tested 2 to 3 times a week, depending on how often they're on site. So it just ensures.
And Louise, is that?
Sorry. Back on it. No, sorry.
Yeah, perfect. And Louise, in terms of that flow, is that transferable to events as well, or like do you just kind of see it kind of going a similar sort of way? Like, what's the key consideration, I suppose, as we start to plan events for later in the year, to make sure that we're doing it safely?
It will transcend into events, and that will allow us to open up and work again, which we're pretty confident on. Yeah, I think the crossover is fairly easy. It's quite a similar environment. So the way we talk about it is it's dirty and clean. So once you've had a test, you become clean, and prior to the test, you're dirty. So there are lots of different ways that it can work, depending on your numbers, on where you are, the size of the event, and also what the clients feel is on mitigation of risk, because that's what we're talking about. So Dawn's touched on the PCR test, which is the gold standard, and then the lateral flow, which you hear a lot about in the press and on the TV, and it's the rapids test that's given a result anywhere between 15 and 30 minutes. Now,
and what are the implications of choosing to do a lateral flow test versus a PCR test? Like, in terms of the actual, again, that I guess, attendee or delegate experience, like what's different from their perspective?
Okay, so firstly, if you would have a PCR test, it's a slightly higher cost to a rapid test. However, rapid tests currently have to be administered by a nurse, so that could up your costs. And things like, if you've got 200 people that are coming into a session that starts at 9 a.m, you would have to consider what time you bring those people in, what time we test them, and also things like social distancing, why that person waits for their result, which can be anywhere between 15 minutes and 30. You have to be able to hold all those people together safely, firstly. So 2 meters apart, everybody wearing a mask, if it's an enclosed inside space. It's probably good to consider testing where there's a large amount of space that's open. But again, that can be dependent on where in the world, the time of the year. So there are lots of different factors that need to be considered. And I would say that every event would have to be looked at as on a case-by-case basis. Things are
perfect. So basically you've got a lateral flow option, which is faster and cheaper, sort of in terms of the test itself, but you actually have the implication of the space that you need. So the fact that it needs to be administered currently by a healthcare professional, and so that you need a lot of space for that. So I guess as we think about venues all getting booked up, as we are allowed to do events again, I guess a lot of venues are going to be at like half capacity or whatever it's determined further down the line. And then you're going to need all the space for testing. So actually that lateral flow or that rapid testing approach could actually be quite challenging and costly from that perspective, although on the face of it, the tests themselves are cheaper. So then, Dawn, just talk me through the PCR experience and how that would be different from a delegate point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. So the PCR testing has to be processed in a lab. So obviously, you would need to bring people. So there's two ways of doing PCR testing. Either you would send it out to their home to be done before they were to come on site, or you would ask people to arrive on site, all be tested, and then perhaps go and stay in the hotel separately until such time as they've had their results back, because all of those tests would then need to be taken to the lab to be processed. Now, there's different types of turnaround time that you can get depending on your budget, obviously. So the lab we work with offers either a 24-hour turnaround as standard, or if you were doing that and say you were bringing 50 crew together on site, you wanted to get them all tested in an afternoon, and then by the following morning you wanted them to be on site, then that would be feasible because you can get those tests up to the lab. They offer a 12-hour service, and then you can then have everybody ready on site for the next morning. But it's tricky with it is very much dependent on numbers, because obviously the lab has a capacity as well. So it's
And can you
feasible
pre-book
to do.
capacity? Could you, when you were working on the film stuff, for example, could you kind of say, look, I'm going to have 300 crew next week or cast and crew next week, and sort of plan that in and help with that capacity planning, sort of just kind of see that end to end?
And that was really my role, was to kind of prep the labs in terms of what we had coming in every week on each day, or try to. And, through doing that, I've got a really good relationship with the lab, and we kind of work with them quite closely to, flag every single day. I message them now to say, right, we've got this number of tests on the way to you, so that they're aware. And then if we've got any sort of bigger orders going in, then we'll obviously arrange that with them in advance. They're really flexible as well, which really helps. And I think it's great to be working with labs that can also be flexible, who kind of get the event and the our industry as well, because I think that's quite key. Like our main contact at the lab, she's actually an ex-event manager herself. So
oh, great, perfect. So she understands the context in which you're kind of working and where you're coming from. So if I was going to attend an event, I'd register for the event, and would you send me a test straight away, or does the test have a life? You know what I mean? Does it have to be near enough to the event date in order for it to be valid? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. So I would say that doing the test, I mean, we can send you out a test anytime, really, because they've got a long lifespan on the test kits. But actually doing the test for a PCR test, I would really recommend doing it as close as possible to when you go on site. So obviously, the closer you do it, the more impact it has on your budget. So if you want to do it the afternoon before you're there in the morning, then that in turn has additional costs to it. But I wouldn't recommend doing it any further out than 72 hours. That's what the airlines are using as their sort of standard. And with any testing, I mean, ultimately, I could take a test today, I could go to Sainsbury's, and I could pick up the virus. It's another level of mitigation. It's not saying we're never going to have a case of COVID on site. It's just another thing to just check.
And it's not necessarily going to change any of the COVID safety rules in terms of how you expect people to behave on site either, I suppose, is it? It's really, like you say, it's an additional level of mitigation, just to provide people, whether they're working there as crew or whether they're attending there as guests, that kind of level of comfort, I suppose. Like in terms of technology and sort of, I guess, access control is quite a key part of this. I'm a production manager, so I kind of think about how I'm going to get my crew in and out, and how are we going to keep them safe and make sure that they are comfortable going from one job to the next, and they know that they're not going to be going into a dangerous environment where they are more likely to pick it up than when they go somewhere else. So have you seen any sort of interesting technology, or do you think that's something that will be coming down the line? Do you have a system you use yourselves, or do you think that all is stuff that needs to be worked out as we move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're on to my favourite topic now, Dave. As everybody knows, I love registration and access control. So essentially, the system that we've developed is it's a fairly simple database type system, but that can then be linked either with an existing registration system, or with
if someone was using, sorry to jump in, if someone was using like Cvent or Event or any of the other kind of tools that are out there, they could actually get they could get access to that data and integrate that with their existing system.
Yeah, absolutely. And if somebody was doing that, we would need to work carefully with them before they sort of launch their registration to actually put together the questions that we need to ensure we have answered before we can issue any tests. So there's quite a lot of information that needs to be collected to be reported to Public Health England. So we would want to try and do that up front so that people are not having to fill in 2 registration forms, because that's just a bit of a messy experience. Also, you'd need to be really careful on the GDPR side, that we were kind of ensuring that there's several levels of consent that we need to test someone. So we've got to make sure that that is covered. And a lot of that is that consent is around their data. So that's quite key. We also have, for crew particularly, I've got a system which is tied in with our system anyway, so that can be used as a crew registration system. So, but I mean, there's no reason why that couldn't be adapted to be a full registration system. And I think that's kind of where we really want to I think that's for me, that's one of the key benefits, is because we have that kind of overview of that side of how it works in terms of registration, badging, those processes normally. So I think integrating it with that stuff is really going to be important, because you don't want to have to go and check on one database this thing and then another database for their badge. It's just complicated.
Going to become quite a nightmare. Now, I'm really aware we're going to run out of time, but I love this conversation. I think it's so important to start talking about this stuff. We knew this was going to happen. I wonder if it's worth, why don't we see if maybe we set up a separate little session, or do like a Zoom Q&A or something further down the line, see if we get some questions, something together, if you guys would be up for that. Because I think there's so much in here that's interesting. But maybe just to sort of finish, I sort of always think about it in terms of my crew, but how should the agencies that we partner with, how should they be thinking in terms of staffing it, and I guess and costing it? I know it's impossible to say, but it's going to be a big chunk of any event budget. Presumably it's like a 20-25% or something, a part of that budget, sort of handling, depending on the size of the event and things. But if they go lateral flow, there's that big staffing implication. If they go PCR, there's again a big sort of, I guess, more technology and sort of checking and cross-checking. People have done what they have been asked to do before they're allowed on site. But yeah, in terms of that staffing question, what do you think is the agencies need to put in place to support this and make sure it's managed?
I think there's a couple of things. Oh, sorry. I'll say what I was going to say, and then we'll flick to Lou, because there's a couple of things that we do definitely need to consider. And I think, like you said, budget is going to be a huge concern with this, because a lot of people who've come to us to talk about testing down the line are shocked at the cost of it. And I always say to people, look, we're not making a huge amount of money out of this. It's an expensive process, because whether you go down the PCR testing route, which is fine, it's great. The cost of the test is more, but it can be done at home. But then you need to work out the logistics of how you get it there, what your turnaround times are, all of that kind of stuff, how it links in with your registration. So there's that piece for PCR. Then you've got, with the lateral flow, like you were saying, all of the other stuff that comes along with it. So it's not just the cost of the test. The cost of the tests are really cheap, but you need the staff, you need the infrastructure. And that staffing piece is huge. So Lou, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about the staff there? Because I know that you know a lot about that side of it.
I would say if you're on a large event, you would normally have a health and safety manager on board anyway, but you would probably need to look to employ a COVID team. So certainly a COVID supervisor that would perhaps link in with that health and safety manager, and then maybe either junior project managers or potentially senior hostesses that would support that health and safety team, because it is now actually a new section almost to your event budget. So there are some key roles that would need to be in place for larger scale events. Once you get over perhaps the 300 mark with guests, you're going to then start to need to employ COVID teams, if that makes sense. And people that are from a logistics background are the people for this role. So there's that to consider.
Yeah, having that kind of operational head on them, I guess, makes a massive difference, doesn't it?
It does. Also, the government is changing the rules and legislations fairly quickly and without a lot of notice. So it might be in the coming month, I'm not guaranteeing this, that maybe lateral flow tests could be used without medical professionals. And that's something that we're looking at, and we're seeing what the government's take on that. And that would change things, because you could then maybe consider sending them out to the guests prior to them arriving on site, and then perhaps having a test in their room as a room drop. So there are lots of ways that we can incorporate this into a world that we already work in anyway. But staffing, it is definitely going to be an impact on your budget. You're definitely going to need a small COVID team. So really, we're watching and waiting to see where the government go on this. So it's an interesting time, and we're open basically, and we've got to be ready. And I think testing is definitely the way forward, and we've got to kind of make this work for us to make our world spin again.
Brilliant. I think that's absolutely right. It's that, the film industry have managed to get going again by showing that they've got procedures in place and that they can do it safely. And I think it's just up to us as well to demonstrate that we can make that happen. So we're totally out of time. I'd love to talk about this more with you because it's such an important topic. But just to say thank you very much. Actually, no, one last question. I'll do this last question because I always do it. Just Dawn this time. What was the best piece of work advice that someone has ever given, or is there something that you live by, just as we close? Thank you.
I quite liked, somebody said this to me, and they said, look, it's not always the last person in the office that is the best at their job. And I thought, well, I quite like that. There's something in that about being efficient and getting out of there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining. If anybody else would like to take part in one of these conversations, we have a whole series mapped out over the next few weeks, but we'd love to hear from you. So please do get in touch if you'd like to join this conversation. But goodbye for now. Goodbye, Dawn. Goodbye, Louise. Say goodbye.
Thank you very much, Dave. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you so much.